The scientific term for movement is locomotion. That's a term that we use in sort of general zoology about when the organisms are moving, that's called locomotion. So humans, we're focusing here on humans. Humans have different structures, different body systems that allow us to move. Okay? And so that includes things like our bones and our muscles, connective tissue. All of those things sort of work together to allow us to move. Our muscles are attached to bones. Bones are part of our internal skeleton. Humans, like most other animals, have an endoskeleton, an internal skeleton that the muscles attach to allow for movement. There's also connective tissue, things like cartilage, ligaments, tendons, that all sort of have to work together to allow for an organism to move. If we start by thinking about the bones, the skeletal system, in a normal adult human, there are 206 bones. Okay? Lots of them are the vertebrae. Each individual vertebrae is that we saw when we talked about the nervous system. Okay, we have each individual vertebrae as its own bone. Okay. Also, a bunch of them are in the foot, not food. That's a typo. So our bones are made of, our feet and our hands and our wrists and our ankles are made of many tiny small bones. So a large chunk of the bones are in there. We have 12 pairs of ribs, and then we have the other bones, that you're more familiar, the long bones, the humerus and femur, ulna, radius, tibia, fibula, cranium. So altogether, however, there's 206 bones. Some interesting things is in babies, there's more. And babies are born with bones that are not fully fused together. For example, in the cranium's made of several bones together. And as we age, they kind of fuse together to form a solid cranium. But that doesn't happen for a little while. Like if you ever are around babies, you might know they have like a soft spot at the top of their head. That's where the bones haven't fully fused together yet. And actually, if like a baby has no hair and stuff, you could see it kind of move a little bit as it moves with their pulse, like it goes up and down. It's kind of weird. But eventually that fills in with calcified bones. So the purpose of bones are multiple. There's multiple purposes. So obviously, the structure of our bones give our body its shape, right? They allow us to stand upright. They give our body structure. But also some bones are for protection. The cranium, our skull, protects our brain, right? A vital organ. All of the vertebrae protect our spinal cord. Again, another vital organ. Our ribs and sternum, they protect our lungs and our heart. So lots of these bones are to protect vital organs. They allow for us to move. Okay? And also they store some minerals. Our bones have calcium and phosphorus stored within them. And when we need some of those minerals for our metabolism, they could come out of our bones and be used. So bones are actual living tissue. You might think of a bone as like dead material, like fingernails or hair or something. But bones are actually a living tissue. Throughout the bones, there's actually a network of blood vessels. There's nerves that go through the bones. So they're living tissue. And then within that living tissue is some non-living material that gives the bone its hardness. Okay? Materials like calcium phosphate, calcium carbonate. Those are the things that make the bones hard. And in babies, the bones start off more flexible. They aren't fully calcified. And so there's more flexibility to them. And as the baby ages, they eventually harden up. And you may have heard of growth plates, for example. These are areas of your bones, for many of you, that are active right now, that they aren't fully calcified, and you can your bones can lengthen and add on to the length of those bones, and that's how you grow taller throughout your lifetime. Eventually, those growth plates kind of calcify, and then you're done growing. Like if you have to go to the doctor and get an x-ray or something, they can see your growth plates, and typically they can tell you if they're closed up, then you're done growing. If they're still not closed, then you may still be growing taller. Yeah. So the bones are made of mostly calcium. That's the most abundant element in our bones, and also potassium, and then a variety of other materials. So the long bones of the body also have, within the center part, an area called the bone marrow. And there's different types of bone marrow. You can see sort of in this bone, you can see the marrow is in the center part. If you if you cook a steak that has like a bone in it, I don't know, I'm a vegetarian. What's that steak that has like a round bone in it? You know, the ribeye? I don't know. But anyway, if you look in the middle of that bone, there's like soft stuff that you can actually eat. That's bone marrow. People serve sometimes bone marrow, and it's a fatty substance that's in bones, and it has an important job. This is where the blood cells are produced. So red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, they're actually made within the bones, and then they move into the circulatory system from there. Then there's also yellow bone marrow. This is mostly fat. Again, it's in the middle of the long bones. And surrounding the bones is a membrane called the periosteum. And this membrane, this is where there's lots of those blood vessels, lots of nerves. This is where new bone material is produced. It's where new bone cells are produced to heal damage to a bone. It's where tendons would attach as well. And we could see this. If you look at this, this is an x-ray. Okay? So this is in a person's wrist. This is the radius and ulna, the two forearm bones. Okay? What you see, this is the growth plate. Okay, so as this person is still growing, right? They haven't reached their full height. And along this growth plate is where new bone tissue be added. And so this person's arms would be growing longer. If you were to look at a fully grown adult, this growth plate here would be filled in. It would be solidified, and they would be done growing. There are special cells called osteocytes. These are the bone cells. They're found within the bones, and this is where new material is produced. And then throughout those bones are these sort of canals, kind of tubes through the bone, where the blood vessels and the nerves are all go through. Okay, and we could see that here. This is showing a cross section of bone. If you look at a cross section of bone, it looks like all these sort of circular spaces with areas around it that have the actual bone material. So you can see these canals are where the nerves and the blood vessels run through. We can see it here. There's these tubes basically where arteries, veins, and nerves are moving through the bone. You probably know the name of lots of bones. The main ones, like your cranium, your sternum, your the middle of your chest, your ribs. What's the name of this bone? Your collarbone. It's one people frequently break. Clavicle. Yep, that's the collarbone. We have in our arms and our legs, the upper part of our arm and our leg is a single large bone. And then our forearm and our shins are made of two bones each. In our legs, it's the femur is the largest bone in the body. Okay? And then the tibia and fibula are the shin bones. In the arm, we have the humerus, which is the one upper arm bone, and then the ulna and radius, which are in our forearms. You can actually feel, like if you feel like your forearm and then like rotate your wrist, like you can feel those two bones. They kind of rotate around each other as you move your wrist. You could feel those bones in there as they move. You don't really feel it in your shin as much. Like we said, lots of bones in your wrists that give our wrists like a very, it extensive range of motion, lots of bones in your ankles and your feet and your hands that all allow for that movement. So where two bones meet, we call it a joint. And there's different types of joints with different functions. So one type is an immovable joint. It's just basically the bones are locked together. We have this in our skull. We have several bones all fused together. That's called an immovable joint because there's no motion that happens there. You can see in this picture of a skull, you could see this is an immovable joint. These are the different bones of the cranium that have been fused together. Can anyone think of why is this a positive adaptation for humans? That the skull is made of several bones and they're not fused at first.
For birth.
Yeah, exactly. During childbirth, so humans have a very large brain compared to other mammals. Humans have a large brain at birth. And so what that means is the process of birth is more difficult for humans than other mammals because the brain is so large. And so having these non-fixed parts of the cranium at first allows for the cranium to be somewhat moldable during birth and during early childhood. And you may know this, that sometimes when babies are born, their skull is all messed up, right? It's all like I have a cone head shape, or there may be an indentation in some part because of the process of delivery. But because those bones aren't fused, they can remold into the proper shape as after delivery. They also allows for the brain to continue to grow somewhat after childbirth, and then those bones can solidify. If they were to close up too soon, which sometimes does happen, then it may lead to pressure in the brain that might be dangerous. So there is a reason for having those immovable joints sort of fix after childbirth. But most of the joints, the boundaries between bones, are movable joints. One type of joint is called a hinge joint. This allows just for a single plane of motion. Like this door, for example, has a hinge joint. So these metal things in here are hinges. They allow the door only to swing in a single plane of motion. Like you can't tilt the door this way, right? You can't tilt it up, it's fixed. These only swing in one direction. So the example of this in our body is our elbows. So your elbow joint only goes up and down, right? If everything's good, this elbow joint doesn't move side to side. Okay? If you move it side to side, you're moving your shoulder, right? But at this joint, you can't hold this part and like you shouldn't, right? Because you can dislocate your elbow. But this doesn't move side; it only moves up and down. Your knee only hinges forward and backward. It's a hinge joint. You could see in this video here how the bone works. So what you see is the end of your humerus has a little like cylinder, and it fits in with a hollow shape, okay, in the ulna and radius, so it only allows that single plane of motion. Other joints have a wider range of motion. A ball and socket joint gives a much greater range of motion. And you can see here, this is the pelvis, and the femur has at the end this round part of the bone that fits in a sort of cup shape, and it allows for a wider range of motion. Our shoulders can move, left and right and up and down. We have this wide range of motion in our shoulders. We also have it in our hips. And so that's allowed by this ball and socket joint. A pivot joint is a joint that allows for rotation, side to side, up, down, like we have in our skull. Okay, in our wrist and ankle, we have these complex joints. And then we have a gliding joint when the bones sit on top of each other. The vertebrae are examples of these gliding joints that all these bones are stacked on top of each other. In between is a thin disc of cartilage that allows the bones to sort of glide over each other. And so each of these bones can move a little bit. And when you add that all up, it allows us to sort of rotate our spine using these this type of joint. And here's just another video of the ball and socket and the shoulder. And you can see this is in the upper arm. Okay, this ball on the top of the humerus fits in to the scapula and the clavicle, and again allows this range of motion. It's held in there with connective tissue as well. It's called your labrum. Okay, you have it in your hip, you have it in your shoulder. Sometimes you can damage it and have a tear in the labrum, and it's painful to move your shoulder in certain directions and things like that. Here's a pivot joint, sort of a complex joint. Also, we have a part of our skeletal system called cartilage. So cartilage is what your nose and your ears are made out of, like tough but flexible connective tissue. That's cartilage. So besides your nose and your ears, it's also between joints. Between, for example, your femur and your tibia and fibula, you have cartilage in there. And that cartilage is important because every time you take a step, your femur is pressing down on your tibia and fibula. This is a knee joint. Okay, so this is your femur. This is your tibia, fibula. And so between them, this white stuff you see here, that's cartilage. So every time you take a step, this cartilage absorbs some of that shock. And so that allows you to not have bone pressing against bone, which would be damaging. And sometimes people hurt this. Like I tore this cartilage in here. This is called your meniscus inside here. And so sometimes people damage it, often in sports or things like that. And so if your meniscus gets damaged, it can cause pain, could limit your mobility in your knee. And so you might have to have surgery. I had mine had to be removed. Like they can't fix it. Once you get older, it doesn't heal. If you're young, you still have blood flow there. It sometimes heals. If you're older, it just doesn't heal. So sometimes just take it out. So someday I may be more likely to get arthritis because I don't have this cushion anymore. So this cartilage is important. It provides flexibility. It provides cushioning. Okay, it's at the end of our bones. We can also see it's our nose. All this flexible stuff is cartilage. And as a fetus develops and grows, most of the embryo at first, its skeleton is made of cartilage. But then eventually that gets turned into bone as minerals build up and are deposited. We also have cartilage, in our rib cage, connecting our ribs to our sternum, and that allows for some of the flexibility as we breathe in and out. And then we have our muscles. Right? Our muscles come in different types. There's different types of muscle tissue. There's smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle is the muscle that lines most of our internal organs, like our stomach, our intestine. They're made of smooth muscle. And this muscle tissue is usually involuntary. You don't control it. Like you don't have to think and say, oh, I better move this Pop-Tart into my small intestine. It's digested, and like purposely contract your muscles to move food along. It just happens. They're involuntary. It'd be sort of weird if you did have to do that. Cardiac muscle is found in the heart. It's a special type of muscle. And it's interesting because cardiac muscle never sort of gets tired. Most muscles in your body with use become fatigued. You can't just keep running forever. Your muscles get fatigued. You can't lift weights indefinitely. They get fatigued, but not your heart muscle. It's contracting every second for your entire life. And so that muscle is unique in that way. And then we have our skeletal muscle. These are the muscles we have voluntary control over. They're the muscles that connect most of our bones together. When we voluntarily move our hands or our wrists, when you write your notes, when you walk down the hallway, you're using these skeletal muscles to do that. They're connected to our nervous system. Our brain controls those muscles by telling them when to contract. And that's what muscles do. Muscles contract and they can relax. And that allows for movement. We've already talked about muscle fatigue when we did our Making Connections lab. And that as we use our muscles, waste products build up, things like carbon dioxide and lactic acid and so forth. And eventually that needs to be removed in order for us to continue using those muscles. Here's what they actually look like. If you look at muscle tissue under the microscope, okay, we have the skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. Okay? And they look different. They look distinct to each other. Skeletal muscle has these striations, these sort of stripes in it. And then finally, the other parts of our skeletal muscular system are tendons and ligaments. Tendon is tissue that connects muscles to bone. So our muscles don't attach directly to our bones. There's a sort of intermediary tissue, okay, that are called tendons. Tendons are really strong, really tough tissue. And we can see here, for example, probably the only tendon I would guess that you know the name of is the Achilles tendon. So at the back of your heel, if you touch right above like your shoe, like there's a really tough, it's a little bit flexible. That is your Achilles tendon. It feels almost like bone. That's how tough and strong it is. But it has some flexibility. So your calf muscle turns into almost, it connects to your Achilles tendon, and that connects to your heel bone. We can see it here. And so when you contract your Achilles tendon, when you contract your calf muscle, it pulls on this tendon, which pulls on your heel, which points your toe down. Okay. So these you could feel tendons in, like if you partially bend your elbow and you feel like right in the crook of your elbow something, that's not a bone. It feels like bone almost. That's a tendon. That's your bicep tendon. It connects your bicep muscle to the bones in your forearm. You can feel it behind your knee, sort of. There's like two strong pieces of tendon that connect your hamstring muscle to the bones in your shin. So all of these muscles in our bone, they're connected not directly to the bone, but they're connected by these tendons. What happens if you damage your Achilles tendon or rupture it? You never heard of that? What's that? It's really painful, and you can't really walk. You can't point your toe down anymore. You need to be immobilized, and it takes a long time for that to heal. What movie was it? It's a little doll, that psychotic doll. He slices a person's Achilles tendon. Oh, is it Pet Cemetery? Wow. Anyway, yeah, damage to the Achilles tendon can be really painful and can prevent a person from walking. It does happen sometimes in athletes. It can rupture an Achilles tendon. And usually I'll put them out for a long period of time. And then lastly, we have ligaments. Ligaments are what attach one bone to another bone at our joints. And ligaments are tough, strong tissue Okay, and we can see some of those here. This is again a knee joint, and we can see these yellowish things. These are different ligaments, okay, that are important in the stability of our knee. So what's the one you probably have heard of? Yeah, your ACL. Right? You probably have heard of the ACL because damage to the ACL, this is a common sports injury. A person can tear their ACL. And so the ACL, it's actually really small. Like you may think, well, this in here is the ACL. It's like inside of the knee joint. Okay, you can see it here. It goes across and connects the femur to the tibia, but it gives you stability in your knee. When you're running and cutting from side to side, your ACL stabilizes your knee so that you can pivot and move. And so sometimes with a certain twist, or if your foot's planted, you get hit in a certain way, you could damage that ACL. And ligaments don't heal very well. It's not like breaking your femur that it's eventually going to heal back and be fine. The ACL doesn't heal like that. When a person does tear their ACL, usually they need it to be sort of replaced. They need to reconstruct it with another ligament from somewhere else in the body. Also, there's ligaments in the elbow, okay? The ulnar collateral ligament that often you might hear about in sports. Who's affected by tearing this, do you think? Anyone know? This is why, anyone played baseball? Yeah? This is why they have pitch counts for like Little League and youth sports especially. It's why they only pitch Major League Baseball players a certain number of pitches before they take them out. It's because throwing curveballs, when you put sort of unnatural pressure on this ligament, it can be damaged. And overuse in youth athletes can eventually cause damage. And so if you tear that, then again, you need surgery to repair it. So these ligaments help maintain the stability. They connect our bones to each other. So what are some things that can go wrong with the skeletal and muscular system? Osteoporosis is one disease. This is when the density of a person's bones is too low. So a dense bone is good because it's strong. Okay? And we can see on this diagram on the left is normal bone tissue. Right? There's lots of bone material. It's very dense. Right? It's strong. It's going to resist damage. But if a person is lacking in calcium, then there could not be enough calcium to maintain that dense bone structure, and the bone becomes less dense. We can see that on the right. So obviously that bone tissue on the right, it's much easier to damage that. You could break a bone much easier if you have low bone density. Often this happens to women as they get older and get through menopause because of hormonal changes in their body. They can lose calcium from their bones, and therefore their bones become more brittle. One thing that can help combat this is weight-bearing exercises. The more a person works out with weights or even body weight exercises, that the body adapts by sort of building up that bone tissue. Because you're stressing it, it builds up, and so that's one of the things that can be done. Arthritis. Arthritis is when the joints become inflamed. Can be painful to move the joints. A person has arthritis. Okay, there can be a limited motion. This often happens again in older age. So I was saying, because my meniscus is torn and removed, now when I exercise, bones are pressing against each other. So eventually maybe I'm going to have arthritis in one knee because that's going to lead to inflammation in that joint. Bursitis is the inflammation around the joints. Tendinitis is inflammation of the tendons that causes pain. So there's all sorts of different things that can happen to the skeletal muscular system. Tendons can be damaged. If you sprain your ankle, you can partially tear the tendons that are keeping everything in place, and that leads to swelling and pain and so forth. So we can break bones. Bones heal really well. Bone tissue can basically heal and be back to normal in a relatively short amount of time. How many people have broken a bone before? Anyone? I never broke a bone either. Wow. Okay. But as you know, people probably have broken a bone. Basically, if you you put a person in a cast, eventually that bone material heals. Now, if you were to break a bone and it's not aligned, what does the doctor have to do? Yeah, they have to realign it. That's called sometimes setting the bone. Because if it's not in alignment and heals, then it's going to be misshapen and it's not going to work properly.